Live from our studio centre here in Moscow. It's just turned 8 p.m. This is RT with international news and comment. Russia and the US have agreed on proposals to remove and destroy Syria's chemical weapons arsenal. It's hoped it could also give some impetus to the stalled attempts to find a peaceful end to the vicious civil conflict. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov and Secretary of State John Kerry outlined a 6-point plan under which Damascus would hand over its chemical stockpiles. Now, the outline will first have to be approved by the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. Syria will now have a week to provide the UN with a complete list of its stockpiles. So-called extraordinary procedures under the Chemical Weapons Convention could be used to destroy the arsenal. Meanwhile, all sides, including rebel groups, have been told they will be responsible for the safety of international inspectors and will have to provide free access to the sites. And the ultimate aim is the complete removal or elimination of all Syria's chemical weapons. Now, if any side in the conflict fails to comply with the proposed plan, the UN Charter Chapter 7 could come into effect, essentially allowing the use of force. RT's Polly Boyko has been following the negotiations.
Press conference here in Geneva kicked off rather unconventionally, with Sergei Lavrov strolling in, sitting in amongst the reporters, chatting about the weather to them, and clearly waiting for John Kerry to show up. But after 3 days of tense negotiations, a deal had been struck. Damascus has got 1 week in which to provide information on its chemical weapons stockpiles, and thereafter they must allow unfettered access to weapons inspectors from the Organisation for the Prevention of Chemical Weapons. Now, in terms of a time frame, well, the on-site inspections have to be completed by November. And finally, the total elimination of Syria's chemical weapons has to take place in the first half of 2014. Crucially, if Damascus fails to comply with the agreement hammered out here, well then Chapter 7 of the UN Security Council could be applied, and we can take a listen to both John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov speaking about that in a little more detail now.
There can be no games, no room for avoidance, or anything less than full compliance by the Assad regime. In the event of non-compliance, we have committed to impose measures under Chapter 7 within the UN Security Council.
We expect full compliance with the requirements the Organisation for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons imposes, and if they are not met, or if somebody uses chemical weapons, the UN Security Council will take measures in accordance with Chapter 7 of the UN Charter. Of course, this does not mean that every time a violation is reported, actions will be taken automatically. We'll first have to verify and review such reports thoroughly, because there are a lot of fabrications and lies surrounding this issue, and we have to be very careful.
Speaking to journalists, John Kerry said that Bashar al-Assad's willingness to comply with the agreement will be put to the test quickly. And if he fails, well then the threat of force could be back on the table, and that the US president retains the right to defend the US and its interests, regardless even of what happens in Congress. Now, at the same time, the commander of the Free Syrian Army has reportedly rejected the deal made in Geneva, saying that it doesn't concern the Syrian opposition because they don't possess any chemical weapons. But during the press conference, John Kerry made an unprecedented admission that Syrian rebels could have access to chemical weapons as well. Another interesting point was made by Sergei Lavrov, who said that the video of Ban Ki-moon reportedly saying that Bashar al-Assad is guilty of crimes against humanity, well, that was in fact a video montage taken out of context and released right in the middle of these extremely tense negotiations. But ultimately, both John Kerry and Sergei Lavrov looked pleased that they were able to come up with a deal here in Geneva. They spoke of how well the US and Russia can work together when there is a political will, and said that they are looking forward to setting a date for a Geneva II conference in October that will start looking at not just ridding Syria of its chemical weapons, but also a peaceful end to the civil war. So for now, at least, after 3 tough days of talks here in Geneva, a military strike by the US against Syria has been averted. Reporting from Geneva, I'm Polly Boyko.
Manuel Oxenreiter, he's a German journalist focusing on the Syrian crisis. He believes the Syrian government would let its guard down by giving up its chemical weapons.
Yet another thing, what is very important too, this is the meaning of chemical weapons for Syria, for the Syrian state, and also for the Syrian people. So we talk about this chemical weapon stockpile in a term of, yes, it is like an offensive weapon of aggression. But for the Syrians and for the Syrian government, the chemical stockpile is a sort of protective armor which shall protect the independence and the sovereignty of Syria. So they will feel disarmed, and it's very, very hard discussed within the Syrian society if this is a good step, and what if there is any compensation for losing this protective armor. The US government lost a lot of credibility, and not just in the world, even among their own citizens, even among the US Americans. So they had to agree, and if you see the message from today from John Kerry, it means very clearly that he left his position from last week. He did almost a U-turn.
The threat of the US and its allies intervening with a wave of airstrikes forced Syrians to flee in their thousands. Europe has learned that firsthand. In the last 24 hours alone, several boats carrying more than 800 refugees were saved from sinking in the Mediterranean and brought to shore. RT's Peter Oliver in Germany reports on the mixed feelings at the new arrivals.
Here in Europe, we may be far away from the fighting in Syria. However, the effects of that violence are being seen in the form of tens of thousands of refugees flocking here to seek asylum. Just this last week, the first of 5,000 refugees arrived here in Germany as part of a new resettlement programme. However, there are those within Europe that say that the EU governments must bear some responsibility for these people having to flee.
The problem is the EU governments continue to support the rebels, including the German intelligence and covertly and other ways. I think it's completely cynical of Germany to pretend to be this humanitarian receptor of 5,000 refugees at the same time they're pouring aid. Let's stop the reason that people are leaving their homes. They don't leave it willingly.
With over 2 million people already having been displaced, Syria's neighbours are overwhelmed by the deluge of those fleeing for their lives. That means that those seeking sanctuary are having to look further afield towards countries in the Balkans that can ill afford to have thousands of refugees turning up. According to some politicians here, nor can Germany.
Our government opens up the door. It's 5,000, then 50,000, then more and more. Our cities like Leverkusen can't finance that. We are broke. It's not Germany's responsibility to solve the problems of the Arab world with our taxes.
There's also concern that allowing these people access to Europe could see the Syria crisis being imported here.
We are worried that those Germans that went there to fight Assad will come back here trained in terror and live here amongst us like ticking time bombs. It's just a matter of time before a train station will be blown up. We demand that our security services stop them returning.
As more people flee their homes, the refugee crisis is one that's set to continue for a long time.
RT Live here in Moscow with you 24 hours a day, coming away right after the break. We look at